first speaker is Professor Dan Arnold from University of Chicago. His title is very nice. Location, location, location. Thoughts on the philosophical implications of locative absolute. Please.
Thank you. So the epigraph here reflects something of what I'm up to in this talk. This is a talk about causation and temporality. But it's also a talk about philosophy and philology, in keeping with Bob Sharf's thoughts about how we could honor the Numata program. And Bob said to all the participants in this regard that he thought that one of the interesting facts about the state of the field was the current state of the balance or lack thereof between philological and philosophical studies. The case for there being a strong divide is epitomized by the presidential address at the last International Association of Buddhist Studies conference, which featured IABS President Anne MacDonald, really calling out the cowherds and being critical in general of philosophically engaged and constructive kind of work. From the perspective, I dare say, of breathtaking hermeneutical naivete. But I think it's fair to say that those two worlds of scholarship, the text-critical scholarship epitomized by Anne MacDonald and the philosophically constructive work of the cowherds, represent extremes on a spectrum that anybody working in this field is on. And so along the way, I sort of hope to not so much make a case for as exemplify something of the extent to which both philosophical and philological concerns are always in play in making sense of Indian philosophy. My philological point has to do chiefly with the various possible ways of reading a certain locative construction and commentators' differences about that. Philosophical point I want to get to, and this is more a promissory note, there's a lot more to be said about all this, but has to do with my reading of Madhyamaka, and in particular, my understanding of the sense it makes for proponents of Madhyamaka, and I'm thinking of Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti basically, the sense it makes for them at once to critique parata utpada, for them to critique the idea of arising from another as an account of causation, even as they embrace the idea of pratitya samutpada, dependent origination. So this, what I have to say here is part of a case for thinking that what they're opposed to is causal realism, and I want to get at a particular one of the several lines of argument that I take the Madhyamakas to have in mind in advancing that critique. And the issues here are actually epitomized by the very compound pratitya samutpada, which raises an interesting series of problems. According to Sanskrit grammatical rules, and they're much the same in English, it's reasonable to expect, this is a compound that has a gerund, pratitya, having depended, and then that has a noun form of a verb meaning to arise. So origination having depended. And in English, as in Sanskrit, we expect that in the case where there's a gerund and a finite verb, we expect for them both to have the same subject. This is a problem, however, because if the same thing that is originating has to have depended first, that would seem to mean that it already existed, in which case, how can we be talking about its originating? So how could it be the same thing that both depends at one instant and then, because of that, then emerges or originates? Madhyamikas experienced this partly as a grammatical problem, and Chandrakirti, among others, had very sophisticated things to say about how the Sanskrit grammatical tradition, in fact, can make this not a problem, that there is flexibility enough in the grammatical tradition to think of the logical or conceptual bases of these instead of being strictly beholden to the idea that they have to have exactly the same subject. So this was recognized as a problem, and talking about it with reference to the grammatical tradition is one of the things that these thinkers did. And I commend to you in this regard Matthias Salvini's article, Upadaya Prajnapti and the Meaning of Absolutives, which gives a really good account of this. There's also, however, a more philosophically general and basic problem about temporality and causation. And I find that the basic problem is well expressed in this statement from J.J. Wahlberg in a totally different context. The problem is that an event's coming to be cannot be conceived as a change on the part of the event or as something that happens to it. And again, the grammar of the compound pratitya samutpada suggests otherwise. It suggests that this thing that has existed so that it could depend, then something else happens to it, it originates. And that if that were the way the compound had to be understood, then it would seem that pratitya samutpada turns out to be vulnerable to exactly the same kind of critique that Madhyamikas leveled against svata utpada, or arising from itself. The standard critique of self-origination by Madhyamikas was to the effect that, well, in order for something to originate from itself, it would have to already exist, in which case, what's the point in asking how it originates? And it would seem pratitya samutpada might admit of exactly the same critique. And it seems to me that thinking about that in connection with things that Madhyamikas say when they're critiquing causation is really helpful in disclosing some central ideas and commitments for them. So Salvini, in the article I just referenced, mentions that there's a close connection between the conceptual problems raised by the interpretation of the compound pratitya samutpada. There's a connection between that and the things that Madhyamikas say in critiquing causation. And he says that there's it's not dissimilar from the structure of Madhyamika refutations of causality. I want to suggest that that's an understatement, that these are almost exactly the same kinds of problems, exactly the same considerations turn out to be in play. And I want to get at that by considering some disputed matters in the interpretation of the opening verses of Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamika Karika, and then follow Chandrakirti's further elaborations of that. And it's in connection with that that the question of how to construe a locative construction is going to come up. Okay? Now, we all know, we learned at our mother's knee, that the Mula Madhyamika Karika begins with this pregnant but baffling critique of all the possible ways in which anything might be caused or produced, in the ways in which anything might originate. And it's in the third verse of the Mula Madhyamika Karika that Nagarjuna first starts to make good on the claims made in this first verse. So the first verse simply asserts what's going to be argued for in the chapter, namely that none of these accounts of the causal relation, the account on which causation is a development on the part of one thing, or accounts on which one thing is caused from another, none of these accounts can be made coherent. And it's in the third verse of the chapter that he starts to make good on these arguments. And the critique of the first position, the position that has it that things originate from themselves, which is traditionally taken to target the Sankhya school of Indian philosophy, that's easy. That's pretty easy for the Buddhists to to get behind. There's little dispute about that. And they tend to be pretty quick in dealing with that one. The harder one is the critique of Parata Utpada, because as Chandrakirti himself recognizes in introducing his own development of these arguments, Parata Utpada, arising from another, would seem to be exactly what the doctrine of Pratitya Samutpada affirms. And it becomes clear that that what's really being targeted is Abhidharmika understandings of how to make sense of dependent origination. So it's that critique, the critique of the Parata Utpada position, that's central for Madhyamaka. And in fact, Chandrakirti thinks, this is evident in the Madhyamakavatara, that this verse really, and the arguments that follow from it, really epitomizes the entire project, such that you can unfold the entire Madhyamaka project in terms of this template. And insofar as it's the critique of arising from another that's especially difficult and especially complicated, that's really where the rubber hits the road in understanding Madhyamaka. So it matters that it's precisely with respect to the third verse of the chapter that Richard Hayes has found what he takes to be Nagarjuna's fallacious reasoning epitomized. So Richard Hayes, in a 1994 article called Nagarjuna's Appeal, argued that central Madhyamaka arguments turn on an equivocation. They turn in particular on an illicit use of the word svabhava in two different senses, and that this alternation makes the arguments fundamentally fallacious, to such an extent that he thinks that their fallacious character explains what I think is actually a historical fact, the relatively small influence that Nagarjuna had on the history of Indian philosophy, right? So he's incredibly significant in Buddhist thought, but in the subsequent history of Indian philosophy, he's not much taken up at all. Hayes's case for this diagnosis centers on the third verse of the Mula Madhyamaka Karaka, the verse in which Nagarjuna explains, among other things, why it follows that because things can't originate from themselves, they also can't originate from another. And here's the verse in Sanskrit, and also in Hayes's first translation. In the article, he runs through a series of things, sort of slowly disclosing the equivocation he takes there to be. And one of the points he makes is that in Sanskrit, it's easier to not notice the equivocation he sees, but that when we try to translate the verse into English, we find it's almost inescapable that we're going to translate this twice occurrent word svabhava in two different ways. So he says that we'll see that there's really, on the first use of svabhava has one sense and the second use has another, in addition to which, and this is what's highlighted in yellow, he sees a locative absolute construction here. So the pratyayadishu, the causal conditions and so forth, the pratyayas and so forth, in the plural locative case, he takes that to be a locative absolute construction. This is the grammatical construction that means while something is happening or if or when something is happening. So he translates when they have causal conditions. Surely beings have no svabhava when they have causal conditions, and if there's no svabhava, there's no parabhava. This is how, he says, we're forced to translate the two words, and this is what discloses the fact that there is an equivocation here. He says the first use of the word says that surely beings have no causal independence when they have causal conditions. This is the sense of svabhava that Madhyamaka commentators often emphasize, just taking quite literally the lexical sense of the word, sva and bhava, self and originating. So for something to have svabhava is for it to be existent by itself, is for it not to have any causal conditions. But Hayes says, well, if he's going to conclude something from that about parabhava, about originating from another, he can only do it by using the word in these two different senses, because the word svabhava also has, in garden variety Sanskrit, the sense of identity, defining characteristic, just a thing's being the kind of thing that it is. So we see two things in Hayes's translation here. First, the equivocation that he sees. So in one translation of svabhava, we've got causal independence, and one we have identity. And his point is that the second statement, if there is no identity, then there is no difference, doesn't follow. Because of the equivocation, the second statement has nothing at all to do with the first statement. In addition to which, the first statement turns out to be a vacuous truism. So the first statement, surely beings have no causal independence when they have causal conditions, basically says, of course things cannot have causal independence. They have causal conditions. So he's taking the locative absolute here when he says when they have causal conditions, in the sense of meaning insofar as they have causal conditions. Because things have causal conditions, well, obviously, therefore, they are not self-existent. So the claim then is true, but uninterestingly true. It seems to be targeting a straw man. However, the locative absolute reading here is not the most straightforward reading of Nagarjuna's verse. The most straightforward reading, and in fact, I suspect this is the reading Nagarjuna himself had in mind, is that it's just literally a locative, and it's saying there is no svabhava, there's no essence of existence to be found in or among the causal conditions. And John Tabor, in an article critiquing Hayes, plumps for this alternative. And he rightly says that if that is not a locative absolute, but instead just a locative in the sense of in or among, we have an entirely different argument being made here. The argument then is that we can't find already existent among any of the things that cause something an already realized effect. And so then it makes perfectly good sense as expressing a critique of the Sankhya doctrine of Satkaryavada, the doctrine that effects are in some way already realized in their causes. But John Tabor then gives this account of why, moreover, on his reading, the second claim does in fact follow from the first claim. I'm not sure I understand his point here. It looks like a strange point he takes Nagarjuna, the second denial, to make. If any of you can understand what you think the argument is, I'll be interested in hearing it. Doesn't really matter for my purposes, though. In any case, Tabor thinks that this still perhaps leaves a fallacy in Nagarjuna's argument, albeit a different one. He thinks Nagarjuna is still playing here with the fallacy, if it is a fallacy, of having a questionable premise, namely the premise that one thing cannot be the kind of thing it is unless its counterpart exists simultaneously with it. This, we're going to see, is in fact a premise of the argument as Chandrakirti understands it, but it ends up being more interesting than it looks. Okay, so Tabor christens this problematic principle the principle of coexisting counterparts. We're going to see that Chandrakirti does in fact invoke this. Okay, so Tabor has a more charitable reading of Nagarjuna in which there's not a locative absolute construction. Hayes sees a locative absolute construction according to which the argument becomes fallacious and uninteresting. Well, neither of them looks very closely at Chandrakirti's comments on the passage. Hayes cites Chandrakirti's first comment on the verse which is admitted, Chandrakirti admittedly whiffs on the first pass at this. But it becomes clear when we look at elsewhere in his corpus that it's the second longer comment he makes that really represents his understanding of the argument. And neither Hayes nor Tabor says anything about this. Here's a translation of the Prasannapada passage. He says, there's no essence of existence that are effects, for example, sprouts, when their causal conditions, seeds, are present in unchanged forms, when the seed is still there, since there would be the consequence that the former are without causes. With respect to what, then, could the causal conditions be other? For being other depends on the reciprocality of two existent things. Here's the principle of coexisting counterparts. Friend and enemy, we can talk about someone as a friend and some relative to an enemy only insofar as both are present or both exist. But there is no such simultaneity on the part of seeds and sprouts. Therefore, given that their essence is non-existent, effects do not have the property of being other, which is what the versus parabhava means. So here it's important that Chandrakirti's comment gives us a gloss of the word parabhava that tells us how to translate it, and he tells us he just means paratvam, he just means being other. So on Chandrakirti's reading, there is in fact a locative absolute here. He is saying that effects are not present when their causes are present. But on his analysis, this is part of an a priori analysis of the very concept of being other. And can we coherently think of being other as criterial for being a cause? And the argument basically is, no, we can't. Being other is an insufficient criterion because everything in the world other than the effect is other than the cause. And there's no non-question begging way to specify which other thing counts. And as I said a bit ago, I suspect this is probably not how Nagarjuna originally understood the argument. I suspect he probably did not have a locative absolute in mind. But it's interesting what Chandrakirti does with this, so let's stick with it. Again, the argument is that the problem with something's arising from something other is that being other is simply not a sufficient criterion for individuating a cause, right? Because being other is a property that's shared with way too many other things. And how can you specify which other thing without begging the question, without presupposing that you already understand something about causation? Because this is supposed to be an explanation of causation, okay? All right. Now the question becomes, okay, is this a good argument? I've said it's probably not as Nagarjuna originally had in mind, but is it nevertheless a good or interesting argument? And in suggesting that there is something interesting here, I want to take a quick look at the Madhyamaka of Chandrakirti. As I said, here's the translation of the verse first, translated according to Chandrakirti's commentary, right? We see that we can still translate, svabhava both ways, the same way both occurrences. We can translate it as essence both times. There's no need to think there's an equivocation. In addition to which, we have a ready translation for the word parabhava. What's the complement term to the word essence that would make parabhava translatable? Well, Chandrakirti tells us. He says it just means being other. Being other is the reason in the argument. Let's turn, though, to the Madhyamaka, where we're going to see it made perfectly clear that this is the argument, the locative absolute argument, is the one that Chandrakirti thinks is the important argument. So Chandrakirti, as I said, thinks the entire Madhyamaka project can be unfolded from the first verse of the Mula Madhyamaka Karaka. And so in the 6th chapter of the Madhyamaka, he proceeds exactly that way. Verse 8 of chapter 6 gives Chandrakirti's own statement of Nagarjuna's statement. Then verses 9 to 13 represent the pretty quick dispatching of the from itself position. And then verses 14 and following, and arguably the rest of the chapter, have to do with the arising from another position. And he gives the same argument here in verse 14, where it's the very idea of being other that is problematic on Chandrakirti's reading, right? And here that's stated in terms of a prasanga, of a problematic entailment, right? If being other is thought to be criterial for being a cause, then anything at all that's other than the effect ought to be able to count as the cause. It ought therefore to follow that you can get a lump of coal from a seed, or that you can get darkness from a lamp, et cetera, et cetera. In the next verse and in the commentary, he entertains an objection to this. An objector says, come on, you know that we don't just mean being other in general. We're talking about being other in a specific kind of way. So the objection, this is in the commentary on verse 15, says the relation of cause and effect involves a qualified sort of otherness, not being other in general. And the objector here has some recourse to things that Panini says about grammatical rules relevant to there being a niyama, a rule or a constraint on any principle. And Chandrakirti responds by ridiculing this appeal to a rule. So Chandrakirti answers, this rule of yours, the rule that the cause of a rice sprout is indeed a rice seed, but that's not other, and that the fruit of a rice seed is indeed a rice shoot, but that's not other, where did this rule come from? That's what's at issue here. That's what we're trying to find out, is how causal regularity is obtained. So he might respond, well, the rule comes from our observing that there's this regularity, and Chandrakirti answers, to explain a rule with reference to a regularity without explaining how the regularity comes about isn't to answer the question at all. If you're in the business of providing an explanation of the causal relation, you can't say that that there's a grammatical rule that works here that's based simply on a regularity. It's that regularity that you're supposed to be explaining if you're talking about causation. And so in verse 16, he just repeats the main argument. He says, you still haven't answered that. Then at verse 17, he more precisely states the argument from the problem with being other as a criterion. And he says, a sprout does not exist at the same time as its seed. How could a seed exist as being other without being other? He's, I think, elegantly making use of the two Sanskrit suffixes here for abstraction, which are typically translated as being. The tva suffix is translated typically as being. And I've tried with the emphasis here to disclose something about how the argument works. He's saying, for something to be other, it has to be something. But something's not existent can't be anything at all. So it can't be other if it can't be anything. Okay, I take it that's how the argument works for him. And he elaborates then in commenting on this by making explicit this principle that Tabor thinks is possibly fallacious or problematic. Again, the principle of coexisting counterparts, that things can only be in relation insofar as both are at all. He then adds a quotation of the third verse of the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, and here specifically tells us it's a locative absolute construction in the verse. So here he tells us that. He invokes the relevant rule from Panini, and this is how he puts the point. If the essence of causes is unchanged, if, for example, a seed is still present and intact as a seed, then a sprout can't exist yet. Sprouts only come to exist when seeds are no longer present. So if a seed still exists with its essence intact, then there's not going to be a sprout yet. Given that an effect does not exist in that case, therefore, its being other, its being anything at all, doesn't make sense. And hence he says this has to be a locative absolute construction. And this, on this treatment of the argument, the point made here in verse 17 follows interestingly from the point made at verse 14, which again was made based on the prasanga that, well, if being other is all that it takes to be for something to be a cause, then anything can come from everything. And so now we see him building on that by saying that not only does being other not make sense as criterial for being a cause, it's not sufficient, but moreover, being other is not in any case a possible relation between cause and effect because it's constitutive of causes and effects that they are not co-present. This temporal asymmetry is integral to the very idea of causation. Okay, and it's at this point that he invokes an attempt to get around the problem. An objector says, well, what about the example of a balanced scale? You put something in the pan of a scale, one arm goes down and the other one goes up at exactly the same time. That's an example of simultaneity. Mightn't it be that causes and effects relate in exactly the same way? And interestingly, you might suppose he would go to town on the example. He's not very interested in critiquing the example. He just responds in verse 19 that it doesn't make the example's irrelevant. It's inappropriate to the case at hand. So, okay, fine, in the case of a balanced scale, there is simultaneity perhaps. But when we're talking about causal relations, we're talking about something definitively involving a temporal asymmetry. So something that's being produced. To say it's being produced, to say it's on the verge of production. It doesn't exist yet, and so on. So the argument he's making here is that insofar as causation consists in this temporal asymmetry, in the fact that you move from cause to effect, but not the other way, and that they're never temporally co-present. This constitutive temporality makes it difficult, if not impossible, to theorize the kind of relation that causation could be thought to consist in. Okay? All right. There's still a question, though, of whether this is a good argument. Is this principle, which seems on the face of it problematic or suspect, is there any reason to think that this argument has any purchase? That there is an interesting argument, I think, comes into view if we look at this passage from Prajñākaramati, a later commentator on Shantideva, who's greatly influenced by Chandrakirti, who differently makes what I take it is the same basic kind of point. Prajñākaramati also advancing a critique of causation and also advancing a critique of the idea of any non-question begging way to individuate causes, attacks the idea of a continuum, right? Someone might say, well, we're not talking about being other in general, we're talking about something that is other but in the same continuum. And Prajñākaramati says with respect to that, well, the restriction or the rule relating a cause and an effect, the rule that we can specify which one is the cause because it's the one in the same continuum as the effect, that rule doesn't make sense on an ultimate analysis because the restraint here, the restriction is simply notional or conceptual, as long as the effect is not originated. Depending as it does on the state of future phenomena, ordinary reference to things like effects is not really true. So the argument, in other words, in this case and in Chandrakirti's, I think, is that, and this is all relevant to something on which Jan Westerhoff has written good stuff, relevant to a charge often leveled at Madhyamikas, a charge that Madhyamikas tend to conflate different kinds of dependence relations. When, for example, Nagarjuna treats the relation between being a father and being a son as though it were the same kind of relation as the relation between cause and effect, on Hayes' diagnosis, it's exactly that kind of equivocation that we see in the verse. On Hayes' reading of the verse, Nagarjuna draws a conclusion about what can or can't be the case in terms of causal dependence based on something that on considerations having only to do with notional or definitional dependence or relation. And so this is often remarked that, it's possibly problematic that Nagarjuna tends to conflate these. I would argue instead that he's not conflating these, but rather arguing that they can't be thought essentially different from each other. That the idea that causal relations and conceptual relations are essentially different kinds of relations can't be made coherent. And the reason it can't be made coherent is well expressed in the passage from Prajnakarmati. It's because that you can't individuate any cause or effect without some conceptual taking of an event, right? Causation is a relation between events. Events don't just individuate themselves. The world doesn't present itself to us in already discrete events. In order to ask the cause of something, you have to already have described the situation so that you know what event it is of which you're looking for the cause. This is the reason why Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti think you cannot think that causal explanations represent a privileged kind of description, that with causal explanations you get the ultimately true description, because any causal explanation will be intelligible only relative to the explanatory interests of some observer. That's what Prajnakarmati brings into view here when he says, no, you can't talk about an effect and a cause in the same continuum because they're not present at the same time. You can only talk about it, therefore, from the perspective of an observer who conceptualizes some total event and identifies the cause and the effect. The point is not that conceptual relations and causal relations collapse and that they're exactly the same. We can still distinguish causal dependence and conceptual dependence. The point is just that you can't think that these are essentially different from each other. Any reference to causal relations is going to involve an element of conceptualization that's always already part of the matter before you get anywhere. So you can't think, for example, that a causal explanation will explain away the very conceptualizing that reference to causation already involves. Okay? All right. That's what it means then for Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti to be critics, I'm arguing, of causal realism. To be critical of causal realism is to be critical of the thought that causal relations represent a privileged kind of relation that give us a unique grip on the way things are. And they can't because they always ipso facto involve this conceptualization. That's what Madhyamikas mean in talking about pratitya samutpada as involving these different kinds of relations. And that's what they mean in saying that of the various kinds of relations involved, it's the conceptual one that's the most subtle and the most important. And my suggestion is that in the argument from the principle of coexisting counterparts, in the argument against the scale example, in the argument that being other is not a coherent criterion because cause and effect are not present at the same time, it's a variation of the same kind of argument. It's pointing out that insofar as there is temporality involved here, there's always going to be some conceptualization. So the argument that Hayes mischaracterizes as fallacious and that Tabor, on a more charitable reading, thinks still might be fallacious, turns out, I think, actually to be interesting. That's all I wanted to say.
The distinction between Baba Hetu and Karya Hetu interlocution. But anyway, so I now invite. Okay. Yeah. Jonathan.
Okay. I have a theory of reading of the verse from the Garfield, which doesn't require the locative absolute. Which is just to say you can't find a swabhava among the causes. And therefore, it does actually extend it supports your idea of the conceptualization being intrinsic to the argument. Therefore, since there isn't a swabhava in the causes, there can't be a parabhava because it's not other than anything. It's only once you have something that is other than that you have the idea.
That you have the idea of identity.
The idea of identity and difference. It would have to be different than something. So the parabhava. So I think that that's a simple and straightforward reading that fits with Nagarjuna's argumentative style overall.
I think that's right, and as I said, I strongly suspect, and there's stuff in the Vigraha Vyavartani that where he's talking the same way, where it's abundantly clear he's talking of using the locative in the straightforward sense. I think that's exactly right. And it's nevertheless really interesting that Chandrakirti puts so much energy into this, frankly, counterintuitive reading of the argument, and he comes up with something that I think is still consistent with the Madhyamaka project, and more interesting than it prima facie looks like it is, because it does look like a specious argument. And the point isn't that Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna themselves accept this principle of coexisting counterparts as part of their own preferred theorization of causation. They're just saying, anybody who would explain this has to be able to give an account that captures this temporal fact, and one thing you could say is that, well, their accounts therefore are accounts of critiques of any account that presupposes svabhava is ipso facto an account that conceives things as static. And so pointing out the temporality involved in here and pointing out why that's a problem for conceptualizing causation is targeting an interesting position, one that would sort of, think in debates in Western philosophy about temporality and the question of whether spatial representations of time are adequate to lived temporality. I'm suggesting there's something maybe kind of similar here.
Thanks, Dan. This is just a historical observation. I don't know if there's a question. It's that the general pattern of argument that you characterize as madhyamaka against cause and effect seems to me a general, not just restricted to madhyamaka at all. So, for example, later Yogacharans have the same kind of concerns about causation. So, as you know, what makes something a cause and what makes something an effect. Generally, we think that causes and effects need to in some way be different, or that difference is either ontological or temporal, right? So later Yogacharans, including Dharmakirti, right, there's a kind of reduction of these effect-cause relations to identity relations, right? And you see in someone like Prajnakaragupta, there's this whole idea of backward causation. And in the commentaries on Yamadi, for example, on that section also on backward causation. And essentially what happens there is they take this idea of difference, of bheda or anyatva, between what we're calling cause and what we're calling effect, and they replace effect-cause relations with yatma-yatma relations, which is just these concentric circle pervasion relations.
Right.
Which means that the notion of, the problematic notion of difference, which all these arguments rely on, is just taken away. And they still help themselves to what they're nominally calling cause and effect, but without the suspect metaphysics of difference. So I think this line of reasoning, although it's being put to a specifically middle way use here, is something that is shared much more broadly.
I totally agree. And it stands to reason that it would be. I take it the cardinal doctrine of Buddhist thought, the doctrine that all other Buddhist philosophy is is directly or indirectly serving is anatmavada, the no-self doctrine. And the flip side of the no-self doctrine is pratitya-samutpada. The reason we don't have selves is that any moment of experience or sensation depends upon a host of other. So right from the start, there's pressure to give causal explanations of experience, of sensation, and those are meant to substitute for whatever a self-theorist would explain with reference to a self. And to the extent that the deep grammar of the tradition thus privileges causal explanation, there's going to be pressure from the start to specify, well, what are the other things upon which this moment of experience or sensation depends? So, yeah.
Yeah, so I had two short questions. One, so you said Nagarjuna didn't necessarily have a significant influence on the history of Indian philosophy. Could we extend the same thing to Chandrakirti? Because when people are arguing Vedanta, like Shankara is a crypto-Buddhist or Chandrakirti is a crypto-Vedantist, I guess they're assuming a significant influence between those philosophers and so on and so forth. And the second question, just to clarify, and I think Professor Patil also spoke to this, you were saying, I think, that we can't have causality without conceptuality. Can we have conceptuality without causality in a Buddhist context?
Okay, good. I appreciate both those questions. First, about Chandrakirti vis-a-vis Nagarjuna, do we have the same issue with Chandrakirti as with Nagarjuna, i.e. about the relative lack of historical influence? Yes, in spades. Nagarjuna continues to be commented on for several generations. Chandrakirti, as far as we can tell, people are silent on him for several hundreds of years. Prajñākaramati in the 9th or 10th century is the first Indian commentator we know of, I think, one of the first anyway, to recover him. And there's an interesting story to be told about why, given Chandrakirti's relatively minimal influence in India, did he become so significant in Tibet. Kevin Vosa's book, Resurrecting Chandrakirti, gives a good account of that. And it's especially interesting given that what was first, when this Buddhist scholastic tradition was first introduced in Tibet, it was introduced by Shantarakshita and Kamalashila, as Mipam is fond of pointing out to other Tibetans. And Mipam says, like, well, let's not be so quick to dismiss Shantarakshita and Kamalashila and their ideas. They were the ones who presented the tradition to us. So it's an interesting question how and why Chandrakirti gets picked up again. As for whether there can be conceptuality without causation, I'm inclined to say no, because here too, these two are, the claim is not that one of these but not the other is essentially real. The claim is that these are not essentially distinct. But to say they're not essentially distinct is not to say they're not distinct at all. And this is an important point because Madhyamaka is often represented as almost a kind of idealism. So very often emphasizing this point about the conceptual character of pratitya samutpada, which Chandrakirti talks about in terms of the category upadaya prajñapti. People say, oh, Madhyamakas, they're prajñapti matravadans. They're saying everything is just concepts. It's concepts all the way down. Well, to read them that way is to privilege conceptual things as essentially real in ways that Madhyamakas would never allow. So there's a great quote from Clifford Geertz that's relevant here. Geertz says, much of the history of Western philosophy is misled by the confusion of making things out with making things up. So the Madhyamaka thought is, yes, there's always some element of making things out in our encounters with the world, but that doesn't mean there's not a world there that we're encountering. That we can't get at it apart from the making things out is an important fact, but it's not the same as the claim that there is nothing out there. And it would be a non-Madhyamaka position to say so.
Anyway, this will be the last question because we're running out of time, so maybe it's unfair because it's too long, or maybe you already answered it. But I thought at the beginning you were going to come around and explain why this kind of deconstruction is at the same compatible with equating pratitya samutpada with the absolute, with emptiness, with the middle way, and so on. Was that there and I missed it?
It was there, and I missed it because I ran out of time. So I was indeed going to come. I was indeed going to come back to this, and And I can't say much more about it. That's another whole story. Chandrakirti, in the chariot discussion in the Madhyamaka and in the other places where he elaborates this equivalence between pratitya samutpada and something being upadaya prajñapyate, something coming into view relative to something else. Those amount to places where he's giving positive content to the idea of conventional truth and telling us what we can say about conventional reality. And what we can say is that everything is dependent and relative in these ways, where the dependence is always going to be shot through both with causality and conceptuality. But through it all, there's an abiding interest in critiquing the idea that causal relations alone could ever coherently be thought as privileged.
So will you have a deflationary read of that then?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
For organizing this event and inviting me to it. So I hope what I have to say today is of interest, and not just of interest to Madhyamaka specialists. So what I want to talk about really is riding the chariots of the two systems. In this case, the two systems are not Madhyamaka and Yogacara, but they are philosophy and philology. And even though I'm going to be talking primarily about Madhyamaka, because that's what I know a little bit about, I don't think what I have to say is specifically restricted to that. And I think it's probably applicable to the study of ancient philosophical texts more generally. This is not just about Madhyamaka. And what I want to talk about today really is just this structure here, which I call the fundamental structure, which consists of three elements that I consider to be essential in the engagement with ancient philosophical texts. And those three elements are, first of all, editions and translations, secondly, texts and concepts, and thirdly, the linkage with contemporary philosophy. And the blue arrows express the dependence relations I see between them. So the text and concepts depends on the editions and translations, and doing contemporary philosophy with them depends on the first two. Okay. And so what I want to do in this 30 minutes or so is basically say something on each of these three boxes, and then I'll wrap up by saying how I see them all hang together. Okay, so first of all, a little bit about editions and translations. So obviously a desideratum in studying Madhyamaka materials is to have reliable editions and translations of all the major texts and their main commentaries available. So obviously we are a long way away from this, and we don't even have that for Nagarjuna, the founder of the school, let alone for the other Madhyamaka authors. So perhaps I should make this a little bit more precise. What do I mean by reliable editions and translations? Well, reliable edition, that's probably fairly straightforward here. I'm simply thinking of the edition of the Sanskrit version of the text, or its Tibetan or Chinese rendition if the Sanskrit is no longer available, based on the best sources available. So that's fairly uncontroversial. Reliable translation, that's perhaps a little bit more difficult. What I mean here is a translation where we get the impression that the translator understood what the text meant. Now you can, and was able to express this in English or whatever the target language was. Now, especially when dealing with Buddhist scholastic materials, this is not always the case. And I think we can all recall cases where we have a translation of a text into a language we understand, but we still don't understand what the text means. Now, I think you can probably all think of your own examples of this case, but rather than giving negative examples of the two categories, I'll give two positive examples of the kind of thing I'm talking about, one edition and one translation. And these two is one is the edition of the Karikas by Shōryū, also taking into account the Buddha Palita fragments. And secondly is Anne MacDonald's work on chapter one of the Prasanapada, somewhat of a bit noir for the philosophical crowd here, I realize, but this material I find is really, really useful, both in terms of the edition and the translation, and I would just hope she would also do the remaining 26 chapters, even though I realize that is unlikely, given that the first chapter is already 2 volumes. Good, so, I mean, this is what I had in mind here. So now, I just said, okay, desideratum, reliable editions and translations, we don't have those yet. So does that mean we simply need to pause work on Madhyamaka materials until all of that is in place? Well, fortunately, I think we don't have to, and I think there are 2 main reasons for that. And I think Jay already alluded to some of these reasons in his presentation this morning. So first of all, we need to ask ourselves, why would we want to translate all these texts if we did not first make a strong case for their philosophical interest, right? Arguably, there are some texts that really don't need to be translated because anybody who is interested in their content would have to know enough about the language to read them in the first place. But I don't think Madhyamaka texts are of this kind. I mean, these are texts that are philosophically interesting in their own right, but it's very hard to make a case for their philosophical interest without actually doing philosophical work on them. Yeah? And the second point is that, and this point has already been made by John Tabor in the past, that in order to translate a philosophical text, we can't simply say, okay, we'll translate it first and then worry about what the argument means, right? So a tentative interpretation of what the argument is about can guide and often has to guide the translation. So we have to have some idea of what the text is saying in order to translate it. We can't just say, okay, we're going to do all of the philology first and then we're going to look at the philosophy. So at the very least, these 2 things have to come in a circle. Right, okay, so looking ahead a little bit, editions and translations of Madhyamaka text, the agenda, well, I think the first thing we would really need are editions and translations of the 4 extant Indian commentaries on the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, so the Akutobaya, and then the 3 commentaries by Buddhapalita, by Chandrakirti, and by Bhaviveka. Now, we have an edition of the Akutobaya, and the situation for the Prasanapada also looks pretty good. For the other 2, it is more difficult. In terms of translations, there is quite an old German translation of the Akutobaya by Wahleser. I'm told there is a translation of the Buddhapalita Vritti coming out with wisdom anytime soon. I haven't seen that yet, so I don't know how good that is. Prasanapada has all been translated into Western languages, but into different Western languages, so that's also a difficult case. And from the Pranyāpradipa, we only have fragments in translations. I think this one in particular is a work that really would need to be tackled by a committee of translators rather than by a single scholar, given the complexity and the length of this work. Yeah. Okay, so on the basis of that, we would then presumably next need to have the remainder of Nagarjuna's other core works and commentaries, for example, the Ratnavali with Ajita Mitra's commentary and the Shunyata Saptati and Chandrakirti's commentary and so on, followed by works of other Indian Madhyamaka masters like Aryadeva, who's somehow very underrepresented in Madhyamaka scholarship. I'm not quite sure why that is the case. Chandrakirti, Bhaviveka, and so on. So I think 2 things are evident at this stage. First of all, this is a fairly modest and limited list of texts, of really core texts for Madhyamaka scholarship, and that doesn't include any of the highly important developments of Madhyamaka later in Tibet and in China. And the second point is that we are a long, long way from even achieving this very modest list. Yeah? So, but I think this is definitely something that needs to be tackled, but it's not something that needs to be tackled before anything interesting philosophically can be done with these materials. Okay, so that's really all I want to say on the first box, on the editions and translations box. So now I want to move on to the second box, which I've called here texts and concepts. So the idea there is to identify components or concepts that Madhyamaka authors talk about across different texts. Yeah? So we are now not confined to putting together a reliable edition translation of a specific text, but we are looking at a variety of different texts and saying, okay, so how is this specific concept tackled in those texts? So what I really have in mind here is a kind of Madhyamaka index, a list of major instances where a specific concept is discussed. Just to take an example more or less at random, some of you might have seen the latest book of Graham Priest on the Chatushkoti, the fifth corner of 4. One of the important problems that is discussed there is the question whether Madhyamakas ever accept true contradictions, right? Now, this is the kind of question that needs to be settled on the basis of textual passages that actually address this issue. And it would be very, very useful if we had some sort of preliminary work on relevant passages that we need to take into account here. Well, obviously, you couldn't just compile such a list or such an index simply by searching for specific Sanskrit terms like, paraspara viroda or so on. So it's not a task that can be easily be automatized, because what you need to do is you actually need to look at the text, think through the text, and try to identify what they're actually talking about. So it's necessary to go through the text in order to determine which concepts and passages are actually treated here. So this would be a kind of a preliminary work on conceptual history, on a Begriffsgeschichte of Madhyamaka, where the development and mutual relation of different Madhyamaka understandings of different concepts is presented. Of course, there's nothing like this so far. For the kind of thing I have in mind, some of you might be familiar with Gerhard Oberhammer's terminology of early Indian scholasticism, which goes somewhat into that direction and tries to give a historical account, an abbreviated historical account of how these concepts are used. But obviously, this is a massive task, even if we're just looking at a small school like Madhyamaka. Yeah? But given that fools walk in where angels fear to tread, I want to talk a little bit here about the predecessor to this idea, which was the conceptual component of an e-text project I was involved with earlier, and that project taught me a lot about the idea of impermanence. This is all now defunct, but I think it might still be useful just to have an idea of what the project was trying to do, because I think the fundamental idea is still something that is necessary and important, even though I'm now less sure than I used to be about the best implementation of that. Well, what it was trying to do was, this is a couple of screenshots from a time long ago, what this is trying to do was basically come out with a list of key concepts within Madhyamaka. It says they're Indian philosophy, but in fact this is all about Madhyamaka. And that list was then supposed to be spelled out in the form of a tree, where you can see here you have a heading like Samsara and Nirvana, and then you have various positions under that, like Samsara and Nirvana don't exist intrinsically. Well, the idea with that project was you could basically go through that list, and the list would link you then to textual passages that support those claims. So the topic Nirvana and Samsara are not different would then get you to, MMK 1610 and a variety of other passages. So that was basically the idea of what was trying to replicate there. The idea behind all of that is to get away a little bit from the presentation in one specific text and to have a more holistic understanding of how a relatively confined group of Indian Madhyamaka texts deals with different concepts, what kind of differences they are, and also how different passages are interpreted in different contexts. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about this second box, about the way how different concepts are treated in different texts. So now I want to get to the final bit, the linkage with contemporary philosophy. So, and this is really, when we're moving from 1 and 2 to 3, we're really moving from understanding Buddhist philosophy as history of ideas to Buddhist philosophy as philosophy. Because everything I've said so far is work that can be done on text, whether or not you think that what they're saying is particularly worthwhile saying, interesting or true, right? So 1 and 2 don't take any position on whether the premises of the Madhyamaka arguments are plausible or whether the arguments are indeed valid. Yeah? And we need 3, so the linkage with contemporary philosophy, in order to find out why the arguments we find in the Buddhist text matter, right? So why they're interesting as contributions to philosophical thought, rather than just as specific exhibition pieces in the history, in the Museum of the History of Ideas. Yeah? And now this is obviously a huge topic, how to bring this kind of linkage about. So what I just want to do is talk about two ideas that I think are worthwhile to take into account when trying to link up work in contemporary philosophy with ancient texts of this nature. So first of all, I think it's interesting to draw a distinction or parallel rather between the study of ancient science and the study of ancient philosophy. So the pictures on the slide there are the pictures of the so-called Antikythera device, which was sometimes described as an ancient computer. It was probably a fairly complex form of an orrery. When they dragged it out of the sea, it looked like the thing on top. And since then, a considerable amount of research has gone into trying to find out how that device worked. Yeah? And I think thinking about the study of ancient technology gives us some parallels when we are thinking about how to interpret ancient philosophical texts. And there are basically two different questions we can ask, both about the technology and about the philosophy. The first question is, how might this mechanism have worked given the resources available to its maker? Yeah? The second one is, how can we build a mechanism that can do the same things or more things, but using the extended set of resources we have available now? Yeah? So one is really focusing on trying to reconstruct from the resources available then how the device would have worked. The other one is basically looking at the device and saying, okay, so it could have done this and this and this. Can we build something that can do the same things, but perhaps we can do it better given that we have different resources available now? Now, in the study of ancient philosophical texts, ideally, of course, you would want to have both, right? You want to have an understanding of how a specific argument worked within the conceptual resources that the author was working about, but then you also want to reflect on it systematically and say, okay, so how could we actually get that to work, or perhaps get to work better by, so to speak, putting different things under the hood? Now, it might be worthwhile to illustrate that by an example where I think that does not work, at least as I understand it. If we, for example, consider Zhuangzang's proof of idealism, what seems to be the case with this argument is that it's an argument that works relative to the structure of Dignaga's logic, but it's not anything that once you try to sort of extrapolate it from that, that you can in any way get going. So it seems to be something that is very, very much restricted to a specific argumentative context, but not anything that is likely to have much of systematic implications. Now, the majority of the arguments, I think, where we want to apply this approach in Indian philosophical texts are not of this kind. And I think we can get both analysis going. So we get an analysis of what is happening against the resources available at the time, but we can also think about more deeply about what the kind of things the texts were trying to do and try to connect that with contemporary philosophical questions and concerns. One way in which we might try to do this link up is by using formal models to study ancient arguments. Yeah? And I just want to talk very briefly about one case where this is relevant in the study of Madhyamaka. And this is the claim that we find in a variety of authors, both in ancient authors like Asanga and in contemporary Madhyamaka scholars like Paul Williams and David Burton. So there is the claim that the Madhyamaka assumption of infinitely descending chains of ontological dependence is logically inconsistent, right? So the idea that it's dependence all the way down, that is somewhere you'll end up with a contradiction. Yeah? And now you'll find that you usually find within these authors I've mentioned, you just find that asserting it, saying, okay, so this is going to lead to a contradiction somewhere down the line, without them being very explicit on what precisely this contradiction is supposed to be. Now, Graham Priest has done some interesting work on that, first in a paper which was called The Structure of Emptiness, and he has since published that again in a variety of other formats. And what he's basically looking at is trying to construct a model of an infinitely descending chain of ontological dependence by using a variety of non-well-founded a variety of set theory called non-well-founded set theory that is demonstrably consistent. Now, of course, that doesn't allow us to decide any philosophical questions, right? It doesn't tell us whether the Madhyamakas were right. But what it tells us is that they weren't obviously wrong in trying to assume that something was logically possible that isn't. Yeah? And this is, I think, probably demonstrates both the restrictions on the introduction of formal models into the study of ancient Indian arguments, but it also demonstrates some of the potential, because even though the introduction of such formal models may not be able to decide the question at issue, so we still don't know whether the Madhyamaka arguments for this are good ones, but at least it's able to inject more clarity into the discussion. For, in the case of such comparisons, at least one of the two sides being compared, namely the formal model, is usually perfectly understood in its details. Yeah? And I think so this is a good example of showing us that we can gain more clarity about what's going on in specific Madhyamaka arguments by taking into account the resources that are available to us. Now, obviously, none of the critics in ancient times had anything like these resources of set theory available to them, but given that we have them now, we can use them in order to reflect on what might have been going on there conceptually. Good, okay, so I want to wrap up by coming back to the fundamental structure here and giving this a little bit of a wider interpretation. So in the same way in which when we try to know a chemical material well, we have to be acquainted with this in its various forms. Also, mutatis mutandis, this is true of philosophical materials as well, and the three components of the structure of philosophical texts that I've described today really correspond to three different states of matter of philosophical works. So we'll start with the editions and translations, where everything is solid. So everything is in its place and nothing moves, and you just have the exposition of the argument within the text. And then you'll move to text and concepts, where things get a bit more liquid, because now the different parts have greater flexibility of movement, and they can be mixing, and you're sort of moving from one text to the next. And then you finally get to the gas stage, which is the linkage with contemporary philosophy, where the different concepts are least bound to their canonical presentations, but can move around relatively easy to combine with other concepts, or we might simply extract an argument from a specific text without being particularly concerned on what else sort of hangs to it, because being a gas, not much hangs to it at this stage. And we can see how that relates to other arguments. And really, I think that the take-home message I want to impress on you is that we need to move through the material through all the three states in order to understand its property, its underlying dynamics, and its relationship with other materials. To that extent, I don't conceive of these three elements in this fundamental structure as a temporal sequence, but I think this is something we need to sort of cycle through in various iterations in order to get a good understanding of what the texts are saying. And that's really all I want to say today. Thank you very much.
John, I'm wondering, the quote that Jay brought along from Bhattacharya,
Yeah.
that said, first we have to understand the philosophical issues at stake.
Yeah.
And only then, informed with that understanding, should we do historical,
Yeah.
go into the historical material.
Yeah.
So you kind of disagree with that, or you would nuance that at least.
Well, like always, of course, I'm trying to follow the middle way here, right? So you've got one extreme, which is philology first, and you've got the other extreme, which is philosophy first, and then you've got the Madhyamaka position, which says you need to need both, right? Well, obviously, you can't find out what a philosophical tradition is saying without actually looking at the text, and I don't think Bhattacharya is disagreeing with that, right? I think that the point of Bhattacharya's quote, and I think Jay was introducing it in this spirit, was to say that the counteract the tendency of thinking that philology is the only way to approach these material. It obviously has to come first, right? I think it's these two things obviously have to inform one another. You can't, without doing the philology, you can't know what the texts are saying. But without having some sort of sophisticated analysis of what is going on there, reading the text is also very difficult because you don't have a range of interpretative options, or only a very narrow range of interpretative options in order to interpret them. In particular, if you have a text in this very concise sutra framework, you really need to have some kind of idea of what might be going on before you try tackling them. So to that extent, I don't think I would disagree with that passage.
Well, first you may be interested to know that the translator of 8 chapters of Buddha-Palitta's commentary, Dr. William Ames, is sitting here.
Bobby Baker's Project of
Bobby
Pradeepa.
Baker.
Bobby Baker's Project of Pradeepa, the first 12 chapters,
yes,
should be out soon.
Right. That is good to hear.
And second, from what I have heard, it seems that it's a problem with incentive to translate these works that translation won't get you a tenure track job, much less tenure.
Mm-hmm.
Is that still the case?
I don't think I'm the right person to ask about this because I have limited experience with tenure track committees. But no, I think in general that is a problem. On the other hand, I don't think you can do a decent translation of any of these materials without a heavy commentary at the same time, right? And I think then things look very differently because if you produce a translation with the commentary, that is a completely different kind of animal, and I would think that also has a different kind of place in an evaluation than a simple translation would do. But I don't know. I mean, it really depends on the specifics. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Would you want to tell us a bit more about what you see the role of the Buddhist scholar versus the role of the Buddhist philosopher? And where would the Buddhist philosopher and the Buddhist scholar fit in your sort of table there?
Well, ideally, I imagine them to be all rolled into one, right? So without this being the case, I think this is the obvious division of labor would be then the Buddhist scholar in box 1 and the Buddhist philosopher in box 3, right? And so have some sort of intermingling in box 2. But and I think this is a position we can probably only aspire to achieving once there is a sufficient amount of high-quality translations and commentaries, as, for example, we have now with ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, right? So there you would say you won't necessarily have to be a very sophisticated philologist in order to say something philosophically interesting on these materials, yeah? But I don't think with the materials that we're talking about here, we are quite at that stage yet where you say, okay, so I'm really interested in doing creative and foundational research on these materials, but I don't understand any of the source languages. Yeah, I don't think we're there yet, but I don't think that this is an aim that could never be achieved either.
About the notion of linking with contemporary philosophy.
Sure.
So I very much like the idea of linking with contemporary philosophy. I try to do that a lot myself. But could you give me somewhat your idea of what the boundaries of the word contemporary are? Just like right now, obviously it's a shifting term. Mm-hmm. And also, is it meant to be saying something about privileging using contemporary stuff, whatever that boundary is, over something that might be a little bit more distant from the contemporary, but maybe extremely insightful or relevant to helping us understand?
Right. Yeah. So basically, what I have in mind here is what Jonathan Ganeri had something interesting to say on the function of philosophical commentaries, and this in his book on, I think, what is called The Lost Age of Reason. And so basically what he was trying to argue was, first of all, that doing a commentary is not at all a derivative, but very much a creative philosophical enterprise. But what he was stressing there primarily is that the function of a commentary, and the function of a commentary, how Indian traditional commentators saw it was to link up an ancient text with the interest and concerns, philosophical concerns of a contemporary audience, right? So to that extent, contemporary is whatever the kind of philosophy that the reader you are trying to get at knows and is familiar with, and you're trying to link it up in such a way that it becomes relevant and interesting to those kinds of concerns, right? And of course, that's a moving target, right? So if all you know is, Anglo-American analytic philosophy, you might need a different link of connecting up than if all you know is Husserl and Heidegger, right? But that's really all I mean by that. So contemporary is very much working like a variable there.
Jan, I take it you don't mean to exclude writing about questions that are not of interest to us today. So, for example, it's not just, there may be philosophical questions that were asked by Buddhist philosophers in the past that we don't think of initially as being interesting, but occupy a great deal of their attention. It may be a question that we find interesting. Would that also count in your linkage with contemporary philosophy or not?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm certainly not advising anybody against doing anything. I think the main issue is that we probably still want to draw a line between the kind of questions and concerns ancient writers wrote about that we can only appreciate historically, and from those that we think there is some sort of historical connection what we are interested in, right? I mean, of course, we might be mistaken about that, and we think, some point is really only of historical interest, and we realize later that, in fact, it has great systematic potential. That might well be true, and you can probably all think of examples where that is the case. So to that extent, I think in the careful study of these materials will take all of these things into account. But it's when I'm talking about the linkage here with contemporary philosophy, what I had in mind were primarily the cases where we can make it obvious or make it easily obvious that there is some sort of linkage with what an audience interested in contemporary philosophical materials might be interested in. Mm-hmm.
So I have a mic, let me try. Thank you for this, Jan. It's great, but I do want to take someone to task here for the question. I think it was Christian's question and your response talking about Buddhist scholars. I mean, many Buddhist scholars, if not the majority of Buddhist scholars, are actually not terribly involved with any three of these things. The work, for lack of a better, it's historical work, and probably disciplinarily is more influenced by anthropology. And by hermeneutics, or by a kind of Foucauldian genealogy of knowledge, where there's a sense in which it's not, if you take the example of a mechanical device, like how would we make a mechanical device that do the same thing? If you take an example of an astrolabe or a sextant for finding where you are in the world, well, now we have satellites and a GPS. So the question isn't, well, this is how we do the same thing. We're actually living in different worlds in a very profound sense. We locate ourselves in the cosmos very differently. So it's not even the way we do the same thing. We seem to be doing things that are... So what I'm kind of missing for this, as much as I like it, is a more anthropological sense that I think, frankly, that's where the real philosophical problem is. What are we doing when we're saying we're making contemporary philosophical sense of this ancient text? There's a context around it that may not be visible in the very act of doing that. I'm not sure if this is clear.
Yeah, well, I think if you take this, take the idea that we are living in different worlds, then that would put great limitations on the ability of linking our concerns with their concerns, right? And that would then, to me, appear very much like, the study of the History Museum and saying, okay, so they had these quaint beliefs, and we can kind of work out what these quaint beliefs were and see how they were related together, but there isn't really anything to study here apart from the intellectual challenge of trying to puzzle out what these people were thinking at a specific point in time, given that we have limited data or interest, right? But I mean, the interesting thing about something like the Antikythera device is that we know exactly what they were trying to do with the problem. They were trying to simulate the motion of the heavenly bodies in a little box where you could turn a handle. So to that extent, the problem they were trying to solve and problems that we are trying to solve are the same kind of problems. And if you don't make that distinction and think, well, basically the ancient societies and we live in completely different worlds, then I don't really see how we could have any kind of connection between them.
You have to at least have on the table the possibility that there are areas of cultural gap, because certainly in medieval China, that was on the table. I mean, the Buddhist exegetes became increasingly aware of the kind of cultural and historical gaps between their world and the world from which the Indian text emerged. So that itself became it was foregrounded as a hermeneutic problem in their philosophical discussion of what in Buddhism stays the same. It became a deep issue.
No, I agree, and I think that is a kind of probably a meta question that you would need to answer before you do any of that, right? Because if the answer to that is not very much, then the rest of this is obsolete.
I don't mean to be simplistic, but I just want to follow on with Bob, especially with this slide. The basic problem, we're still trying to solve is human suffering. Therefore, the vehicle for that solution is mind. So all the texts and all the commentaries and anything everybody has ever written has come from some form of first-person experience. Even if you were only doing Sutrayana, you were not a practitioner, which happened a lot in the ancient world. Still, the interpretation is mind and suffering. And it seems to me the through line here with philosophy, even Western philosophy, is that, and trying to understand processes by which we create it, or sustain it, or are able to cessate it. So.
Thank you. Was it a question or just a comment?
I feel like the question for you is, you've introduced a frame and a model to be able to make the connection. And yet, I also hear you distinguishing between philosophy and trying to figure out exactly what they were trying to do.
Yeah, thank you. I don't think that the contrast I wanted to make was so much between what they were trying to do and what we are trying to do. I think the contrast I was trying to look at was more the kind of conceptual framing that we find for the problem, right? So if we assume that ancient Indian thinkers and contemporary thinkers were involved in completely different problems, then of course there wouldn't be much of a ground in connecting them, right? So this is all based on the premise that they are actually, we and they are actually interested in similar problems, but the problems are conceptualized in different ways. And what I'm interested in is finding the kind of conceptual link, or if you want to say a conceptual translation that goes from one to the other, in order to see how the study of one can be relevant for the study of the other.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I can't
no.
from University of British Columbia, and she's going to talk on salience, attention, and exclusion.
Hello, everyone. So my presentation here, I'm going to talk about two things that seem like they're not, maybe shouldn't be put together in exactly the way I'm trying to: attention and apoha. To give a bit of a background on that, I'm relatively new. I'm somebody who just came up with a PhD in religious studies, but through a program that focused very much on philosophical topics. Did philological work in Europe at the University of Vienna as part of my dissertation. Worked at first in a religious studies department in George Mason University for 2 years, and now just got a job in a philosophy department at the University of British Columbia. And so in the course of all of these various negotiations, I've been kind of coming up through the middle of the mess that we've all been identifying here with the disciplinary pulls of like doing philosophy or doing philology or doing religious studies or anthropology. So the paper that I'm going to give today is an attempt to satisfy, I suppose, maybe, but at least put together three different audiences. Contemporary philosophical discourse about attention, work that's being done in Buddhist studies about apoha, this very, very, very complicated theory of concept formation, and then also do it from a perspective that recognizes the value in the anthropological perspective that Bob was bringing up, and that one of the people in the audience here was bringing up with her question, that sort of what I got out of religious studies is that there's a kind of way of approaching a text from inside that allows you to do both very careful philology and very careful philosophy, but perhaps with a sort of different way of understanding what the implications of that might be. Okay, so why is it weird to be talking about attention and apoha? So first off, if you wanted to look for discourses about attention in Indian philosophy, then there are a lot of more direct parallels than going straight to apoha, which is a theory of concept formation. And if you're working on attention in the contemporary academy, you have most likely never heard of apoha and have no reason for thinking that it could be relevant to you in any way whatsoever. And so what I want to do today is take the question of what does it mean to have an experience of a determinate object, and how does that work? And then look at one particular strand in contemporary theories of attention that looks at attention as an emergent phenomenon as opposed to either a bottleneck or a causal input. I'm going to look in particular at Alan Allport's work on this topic, but there are a lot of other places where there could be parallels drawn. And I'm going to look at that type of theory of attention in relation to apoha, because apoha, I think at root, is about the question of how it is we come to see specific objects and identify them as being the same as things that we have perceived previously in the absence of any kind of universals. So we're looking again at a situation where we have perceptions that are very clearly structured in terms of what seem to be permanent subjects and objects, and yet those subjects and objects are actually a resultant of a process, not inputs to a process in a straightforward way. Okay, so I'm going to try to do something in this messy middle of being both philologically responsible and hopefully philosophically relevant, and we will see how it works. And so I want to start this with the question of why it is that apoha is salient for Dharmakirti. So why is it that Dharmakirti would himself bother to have this particular theory of concept formation that, given its complexity, its history, and debates, is not straightforward in any clear way? And the answer is that it has to do with his position in a larger Buddhist universe that rejects the idea that there are such a thing as real universals. And that position makes it difficult to account for how inference functions. And so I'll now go into this a little more. Okay, so Dharmakirti emphasizes that the role of inference is to remove erroneous determinations about a real thing under consideration. In many traditions of classical Indian philosophy, the role of connecting two terms in an inference is fulfilled by a positive universal. Two terms are connected because they share a certain universal property, which is put forth as the evidence for their connection. However, Dharmakirti argues that a universal could not fulfill this role for two reasons. First, universals are logically incoherent because they fail a neither one nor many analysis. And second, universals are causally inert because they do not change, and causality requires change. Dharmakirti formulates his theory of apoha to account for how inferences work without universals, and then generalizes the role of exclusion to account for the functioning of any kind of universal. And so I'm just quick run through here. So in line with other classical Indian pramana theorists, Dharmakirti understands the basic structure of an inference as follows. A subject is qualified by a predicate because it has another quality that is being adduced as evidence. This is a very condensed quick run through. In order for a certain piece of evidence to demonstrate an invariable relationship between a subject and a predicate, Dharmakirti holds that this evidence must either be causal or based on identity. For him, merely observing that the evidence is present in similar cases and absent in dissimilar cases is not enough to establish a causal connection. Moreover, without some essential connection between the two terms, one may merely be observing a correlation and not a necessary relationship. However, Dharmakirti recognizes two related programs that he will address head-on in his section on apoha. First, if the subject and the predicate of an inference must be connected in terms of their inherent natures, then the inference is tautological and does not actually prove anything. And second, how is it possible to divide up a partless real thing into various concepts which seemingly indicate different aspects of its nature? So basically, we need something that does something in an inference that it seems like there's nothing that can do it. And that's the problem that gets set up here. Okay. So for Dharmakirti, the only way to avoid these faults is to assert that universals function through exclusions, hence apoha, not through positive terms. Inference cannot operate by connecting some parts or properties of a real thing to other parts or properties. Since a real thing is singular and unique, it has no parts, and any perception of this real thing must perceive all of it at once. As he says, it is not possible to see a partless thing in only one respect. The same logic applies to the properties of a real thing too, since a real thing and its properties are not different. And as he states, when a real thing is grasped through inference, if there is a determination of one property, all properties are grasped. In this way, if one accepts the idea that a real thing is unique, then inferences cannot function by connecting two unique real things precisely because real things are confined only to themselves. In reality, they are not connected to anything else. All one could do in an inference is state that the essential nature of a real thing is its essential nature because of its essential nature. And clearly this is less than useful. In his apoha theory, Dharmakirti addresses how a real thing's difference from everything else provides the necessary grounding for the construction of and connections between multiple concepts without violating that real thing's unitary nature. So Dharmakirti introduces his first verse on apoha with an objection about tautology, referred to in Sanskrit as the fault that the evidence would be part of the object of the thesis. Rejecting the idea that this fault applies to his argument, Dharmakirti contends, all entities, because they are delimited in their own inherent nature, naturally participate in exclusions from homogeneous and heterogeneous entities. Therefore, different types are conceived based on whichever thing from which there is the exclusion of objects, which highlight their particular differences. Therefore, the particular difference that is known through a certain property cannot be understood through another. Therefore, the delimitation is different. So apoha enters into the discussion of tautology because the content of the judgment that both terms and an inference are capable of producing is not a positive universal, but rather is merely a negation formed through the exclusion of anything that is not relevant to a perceiver's goals in a given moment. As we have seen, the content of this judgment cannot be a real universal because this would require the natures of the universal and the particular to be mixed, and real things are not mixed. The fact that a particular is unique means that it is excluded from everything else. It is therefore possible to associate an infinite number of exclusions with any real thing, for there are an infinite number of other real things from which it is excluded. The formation of a certain concept through a delimitation of one set of exclusions as opposed to another is guided by practical concerns. As Dharmakirti says, there are just as many expressions as there are exclusions, which are formed through the rejection of what does not have those causes and effects in order to engage in practical activity. Depending on how a perceiver carves up these exclusions, this perceiver may form a judgment about the particular in question that associates it with other particulars which also participate in some of the same exclusions, but since these exclusions are not real things, the particulars do not in fact share anything. Dharmakirti thereby claims that he has addressed the original objection. As he says, therefore, although their inherent natures are not different, that object which is named by whatever property is cognized as different, it cannot be cognized by another. Thus, all words do not have the same meanings. It is not the case that the reason is part of the content of the thesis. One of Dharmakirti's key moves to maintain that a unique particular shares nothing with anything else, and yet can be judged to share certain things with others, is to emphasize that the role of concepts is to eliminate potential errors. The determination embodied in the judgment of sameness simply presents the point at which a goal-driven sentient being decides that the object before them is close enough to fulfilling their goal. The remaining differences are glossed over in favor of achieving one's aim. As he describes, this is a bit of a long quote, an expression produces a false cognition which arises through a superimposition of that single nature onto objects that are devoid of a single nature. Because the appearance is false, even though it cannot produce those effects, it is imagined as producing the effect of those things. This false cognition has as its seed only real things whose natures are distinct, but imaginatively determines them to be the same. However, because it is a factor that contributes to avoiding what is other than that real thing, ultimately it is said to be not misleading about the real things that are distinguished from it. In this way, Dharmakirti leverages a real thing's difference from everything else to claim that concepts may be constructed based on the differences that two real things seem to share in relation to a specific perceiver's goal. For Dharmakirti, the primary reason why a perceiver would be able to judge that two things are, in some meaningful way, the same is because these two things have similar causes and effects. At the most basic level, two things may be judged to be the same because they seem the same to a certain perceiver. A combination of the thing's causal capacities, the perceptual organs, and the goals of a perceiver lead this perceiver to gloss over the differences between two real things and create an awareness in which the two appear as the same. This idea that what is common among a certain group of particulars is their difference from everything else is behind a certain oversimplification that a concept formed via exclusion boils down to a double negation, as in the common refrain that in Apoha, a cow is just not a non-cow. However, the exclusion shared by various particulars is not some kind of ingenious double negation, but rather the result of practical concerns in the everyday world. Far from an abstract logical entity, a universal qua an exclusion is eminently embodied and pragmatic. The recognition that one thing is the same as another thing is based not on the two things actually sharing the same nature, but rather on a perceiver's experience that they have the same effect in relation to a certain goal. This awareness is erroneous because it glosses over the differences between particulars in favor of the incorrect but useful judgment that two things which fulfill the same goal are in fact the same. Following this line, the reason why Apoha is potentially helpful for understanding how an attentional object could be an emergent phenomenon is that the determinations of both cow and non-cow are both formed simultaneously based on how a perceiver parses the infinite exclusions associated with a given particular. This parsing arises from a fully embodied goal and habit-oriented interaction between an organism and a world. Attention to a cow represents neither a spotlight on some pre-existing entity, nor a bottleneck in information processing. Non-cows do not exist any more than cows do. Rather, both the concepts cow and non-cow are equally unreal from the perspective that they present what is actually an unreal exclusion as if it were a real thing in the world. The extent to which they are conventionally real is connected to whether or not they can effectively guide practical activity. Attention does not require pre-existing objects to grab the awareness of a stable subject. Rather, the attended object is the result of a dynamic process of exclusion. So that's the basic idea. And now I'm going to go a bit more into Allport's works to talk about how this could potentially be relevant to contemporary theories of attention. All right, so as we've seen in Dharmakirti's works, human experience emerges as a complex interplay between and within subjects and their environments. Contemporary theorists that see attention as the emergent result of a whole-body relationship between an organism and its environment provide a salient point of contact. According to these theories, attention is not a series of processes that create a bottleneck in relation to the information about an object that the brain is able to process. Rather, attention, and therefore focus on a discrete object, is the resultant of the integration of various cognitive processes. So Allport argues that attention should be understood, quote, as an emergent property of psychological processing. Contrasting his theory to a number of other currently dominant models of attention, Allport states that attention is, quote, the outcome of the integration or binding process. A better way of stating the idea is perhaps that dynamic binding, both the integration and the segregation of ongoing neural activity is the relevant causal process and attentional phenomenon, including attentional limitations, behavioral bottlenecks, limited processing capacity, are its manifest behavioral consequences. So that's Allport's idea. Allport, moreover, emphasizes that attentional phenomena, understood in this way as the outcome rather than the input for the formation of a determinate perception of an object, manifest via the selective integration and segregation of various neural networks. As he summarizes his arguments, spotlights, bottlenecks, limited capacity, he says, and the like are not names of identifiable causal mechanisms, but the names of phenomena that manifest as the consequences of these neural interactions. And central to these interactions are the processes of dynamic binding by synchrony, linking together coalitions of active units and segregating them from all others. On this view, attention depends on a simultaneous suppression of some neural networks while others fire in unison. Which networks are thereby activated or suppressed depends on a complex interaction between top-down and bottom-up factors. Bottom-up factors consist of the causal limitations placed on the objective content of a factor. Top-down factors are the ways in which habits and preoccupations of a subject shape how he or she perceives this objective content. Allport emphasizes that these different forms of bias signals in fact do not operate independently, but rather cue each other in complex cycles. This articulation of attention as an emergent phenomenon involving a whole body relationship between an organism and its environment has clear parallels to Dharmakirti's account of attention to a discrete object emerging through goal and habit-oriented embodied action. Moreover, as Allport indicates, the integration of various sensory inputs depends on a simultaneous segregation of neural networks representing competing phenomena. Dharmakirti's account of how a judgment of sameness produces a determinate awareness through the exclusion of perceptual information irrelevant to a subject's goals provides a compelling way of thinking through how integration and segregation could concurrently work together to produce a determinate awareness. Dharmakirti's theories contribute a further refinement of how exactly this process occurs, addressing a number of what I see as lacunae in contemporary theories. As Allport indicates, one of the most prevalent of these explanatory gaps concerns exactly how different top-down and bottom-up bias signals interact and come to prominence, resulting in the appearance of an executive control guiding the selection of an object. The nature and mechanisms of this executive control, however, remain an embarrassing zone of almost total ignorance, as Allport quotes Stephen Monsell's appraisal of the situation. An interesting path forward here could focus on the role of exclusion in producing the experience of a narrative subject who seems to actively control his or her actions. Although for Dharmakirti, the mere division of a moment of awareness into subjective and objective content is non-conceptual and therefore pre-apoha, the illusion of oneself as an enduring agentive subject is just as much a conceptual construction as the illusion of an enduring external world within which one acts. Both of these phenomena are the result of patterns of habituation based on an individual's past experiences. These patterns further dictate not only the moment-to-moment goals that superficially guide concept formation, but also themselves constitute and limit potential experiential worlds. Allport's theory also raises a number of questions as to the relationship between attention and consciousness. Against a number of other contemporary theorists, Allport aligns attention and consciousness. Such an alignment puts pressure on the question of the relationship between the determinate objects of awareness and the non-conceptual grounds from which they are delimited. If attention is a determinate phenomenon, then this alignment of attention and consciousness would seem to strongly contradict Dharmakirti's insistence that mental particulars are the inputs to apoha, not its outcome. However, a closer examination of each tradition shows that there are two fundamentally different senses of consciousness employed here. In much of contemporary Western philosophy and cognitive science, consciousness denotes a state in which one is conscious of one's own awareness of some object, be that object external like a chair or internal like an emotion. In line with this use of the term consciousness, for example, in discussions of phenomena such as blind sight, a distinction is often drawn between the first-order perception of the blind sight subject and that subject's lack of a second-order consciousness of that perception. Along these lines, consciousness is often presented as an intentional state wherein one knows that one perceives something and can report on this perception. How Dharmakirti thinks about consciousness in a very different way. Most fundamentally, consciousness is the non-intentional stream out of which limited subject-object structured perceptions arise. Far from being second order and intentional, it is actually the ground for first order cognitions and is itself unstructured by subject-object duality. Reflexive awareness, which is a fundamental feature of non-dual consciousness, fulfills the role of ensuring that it is possible for one to subsequently report on the content of one's awareness, regardless of whether or not the subject introspected at the time of a perception itself. Dharmakirti's contention that non-dual consciousness underlies all phenomena of the conventional world, including the external objects that seem to exist independent of awareness, clearly indicates that he pushes the notion of consciousness far deeper than its usage in much of contemporary cognitive theory. This point of divergence may provide a philosophical opportunity. It seems that for Dharmakirti, consciousness is not an all or nothing state. We are aware of various objects to varying degrees, and we form determinate perceptions based on only some aspects of our awareness. While attention to a determinate object is an emergent phenomenon, consciousness itself is not. Consciousness is not an epiphenomenal state whose origination must be accounted for at a certain moment in a perceptual process. Consciousness has been there all along. It is its delimitation, not its arisal, that characterizes a determinate awareness. And that's where I want to stop, because this is, I think, the point where engaging with the particular philosophers who my work engages, so Dharmakirti and later Apoha theorists, starts to really push farther than I've found people are often comfortable with in cross-cultural engagements. So it's relatively simple to try to pick up some of the questions and assumptions and ideas that port from one context to another. But what I've found by really trying to approach these texts more or less from the inside, but doing so because I think that they are philosophically meaningful, is that oftentimes it's the points where these texts fundamentally challenge or disagree with our basic understandings of reality that they become the most useful. The idea that everything in our world, subjects and objects alike, are actually delimitations of an underlying form of non-dual consciousness is something that it's hard to get a room full of analytic philosophers to get on board with. And yet that is actually something that I think Dharmakirti's arguments lead to. And it's not just Dharmakirti's arguments that do that, it's an entire conglomeration of traditions coming out of classical South Asia and moving into other parts of Asia and beyond that have rigorous reasons for thinking that our universe does not consist of independent, permanent subjects and objects that are, some of them are real in terms of being matter, some of them have some kind of aspect of mind, which is maybe just reducible to matter, or maybe not real at all, or maybe some other thing. There are real principled arguments against these kinds of ideas, and it's actually by digging down and into and then emerging out of these texts that we can find some of these points where it's not just that we figure out how to do better what they were trying to do, but we actually see where these ideas should change how we are doing philosophy now and how we think about the world now. Yeah.
My son was born 36 years ago. I named him Dharmakirti.
Really?
In Japanese, also. So.
Oh, that's amazing.
Anyway, this is a joke. Now I invite questions and comments from the crowd. Please.
Thank you very much, Kat. I also, as you know, very much like and appreciate the last methodological point you kind of made. That's exactly right. It's often the places where there's something different or something weird that we have the most to learn, not just the places where it's already familiar. So thank you for making that point. I would ask you a question about the way you see Apoha. So you said that we, in a way, construct concepts based on context, or context may depend on our needs or expectations or whatever. And it seems as though there's some kind of, we have a kind of capacity to direct the kind of concepts that are constructed. Because we're not constructing everything all at once, I guess. So is that capacity or faculty, or whatever the right word is, that enables us to construct different exclusions, that allows the exclusion process to be different, even with respect to the state starting point? How do you account for that?
So thank you for this question, because this gets straight into the other point that if I say this word in a group of analytic philosophers, I've actually had somebody say, oh, once you get into that superstitious nonsense, I just don't care. Because the answer is it has to do with karma. Because it's not just the case that we are like, that we sort of poofed into existence when we were born and will just poof out of existence again once we die. The fact that we are here, and all of us, in a relatively intersubjectively stable world, is the result of causal patterns that have been happening since literally beginningless time. And it is the fact that we share enough of the same causal conditions that leads us to be making relatively the same types of judgments about our surroundings that we can act together. And in terms of like why, I would be making a particular judgment as opposed to another one, it goes to like my specific karmic conditioning. So what it is about both like the my subjective factors, so like my mental capacities, my embodiment, my goals and desires, all of that, in relation to the sort of content available to me in my environment, it's going to be the interaction between those two things that lead me to create a certain kind of determinate world, and also to create my own understanding of myself as a subject within that world. Yeah.
Maybe Parliament has your own
Yeah.
opinion.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up question, not my opinion. So it seems right that at some point you have to appeal to karma.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if you have to appeal to karma right away. So for example, I see a glass on the table with water in it, right? In one context, I may be thirsty, and so there I construct that glass of water as something that I can reach to slake my thirst. In the other case, I'm angry at Jonathan, so I see this as a potential projectile. In another case, I might need a paperweight. So to explain the different constructions there, I don't have to appeal to karma. I can appeal to something more local, and maybe something that your analytic philosopher colleagues would find more friendly.
Yeah, so I think that's right, but I also think that if you poke it a little bit, then you very quickly have to get to karma, because there's the question of like, who are you, and why do you have these goals and desires, and why is it that like you think Jonathan exists as a potential object of your anger, and all of those are about karma. Because just as much as there are no like permanent objects, no universals also means like no universal of ourselves.
Okay. Well, maybe Jonathan.
Yeah, just a quick comment. Follow. Sorry, go.
Sorry. Thank you. So I just wanted to follow up on that. I mean, I'm going to give my own talk, so I don't need. I say a lot of these things following from some of the things that you're saying. It's just going to blow everyone's mind. Anyway. But my question actually is, yes, of course, once you use the word karma, the colleagues in the philosophy department are just going to shut down. But once you explain what you just explained,
Yes.
Does that reopen the conversation?
Sometimes, but actually not always. And this is something that, okay, so sample size of 1, clearly. But in my sort of strange meandering between different disciplinary norms, one of the places that I found it most difficult to continue to have conversations with people in like Western influenced disciplinary philosophy, even if I explain sort of what this means, is precisely surrounding karma. So I think there may be something about, and Jay's got a hand, so I think maybe you haven't had these same problems, or it's better, but in my experience, that's been a hard one.
Just real quickly, I have found it extremely useful to think about when you present things about karma, or what you might think are spooky ideas to the analytic audience, let's just pick on them for a minute, is just to make the whole system a little bit more clear, because analytic philosophers usually are willing to say, oh, I see that I might be committed to this when I accept more of the elements of a complete system. But when you stop short and just talk about this, they're like, I'm going to get off the boat. You're like, well, I'm not telling you to get off the boat here. I'm saying there's a complete system that explains, for example, expectations, carving out nature, the nature of the cell. The whole system is something that I think they can't then just walk away from. Sometimes they have their own systems that have weird, spooky elements. They're just not sharing them.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Kat. That was a very, very rich talk. And I just wanted to come in on karma. I think, and it's just a really boring methodological point. This is not a critique in any sense. I think that in contemporary discourse, the word karma is kind of like one of the least skillful terms to use, only because it's migrated from Sanskrit into English. And it means something very different in English from what those of us who are reading these books see that it means in Sanskrit. So if instead of using that word, which in English means something like spooky supernatural fate or something, right? And that's not what you mean. It's often helpful just to say, let's talk about the complex network of causes and conditions and history that we all share as a species, as a culture, as friends, versus the specific kind of history and biology that I share. So this interaction is conditioned by my genetic heritage, by my cultural heritage. We share a lot of cultural heritage, not quite so much, but some genetic heritage and so forth. And that's the kind of thing that analytic philosophers say, yeah, of course, keep going. And instead of saying, no, get out of that spook stuff. Right? And the boring methodological point is that often when we're trying to do the kind of thing that you're doing in Buddhist studies, to try to bring a philosopher like Tamakirti into a conversation about Taogen science, what we have to do is be very, very careful about the language that we use in order to bring people along rather than to put them off. And karma is just a funny word because it's an English word now.
Yeah.
And when you use it in English, you just end up misleading. There's all kinds of words like that, right?
Yeah, I thank you. I appreciate that point a lot. And I wasn't thinking about karma being an English word. That's an interesting way of putting it. Yeah. We should talk. I would really like a word or at least a short phrase that I could, because if I try to talk about what it means all the time, then it's...
The term that I just used is the result of our history, our evolutionary and cultural history. And anybody's willing to, not anybody, but many people are willing to agree that the way I see something, the interests I have, are determined by my cultural and biological history. That's basically, I mean, that's a naturalization of karma.
Yeah.
It doesn't need you to talk about spooky stuff. It doesn't need, you don't even need to mention.
See, but that's the thing, you have to whisper it. But that's...
But you don't have to mention it, because what you really want out of it is the fact that my current existence is part of a very large natural condition.
But I think that you miss something fundamental if you limit karma to stuff that doesn't have to do with rebirth. Because I think what they mean by rebirth is not cat soul hanging out through samsara. They mean something, they mean things about causal, but there's...
Rebirth is an English term too.
Yeah.
And you've just got to be careful, I think, not to use English words that have already got words in English. If what you mean is something in Sanskrit that has got a perfectly decent way of being expressed in different English.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a little bit tricky I don't want to just completely cede some of the complexity that I think I see in karma that's not present in particular in evolutionary theories, and especially the idea of worlds and the sentient beings within them co-constructing, I think is something that can get lost really easily. Also, just talking about evolution can make it seem like I'm falling into the same kind of naturalist, materialist ontology that most evolutionary theories have, and I think that can be pretty destructive in terms of, if you make it too similar, then people think that you share a lot of assumptions that you don't. But if you keep it too different, then they won't listen to you. So that's kind of the fundamental stick, yeah.
This is just, again, on the same point. I also don't think that
karma is the issue here, because I think how you can spell out karma in this context is simply as a linkage between intentions and hedonic states. And that kind of linkage is something which is very apt for empirical confirmation or disconfirmation. So I don't think that is the issue. I mean, what I think you and the analytic audience is really concerned about when it comes to spooky stuff is the continuation of consciousness after death. Now, I seem to be one of the minority of people that thinks that it's an essential element in Buddhist thought and can't just be taken out without reducing Buddhism to something it's not. But that's a completely different discussion to have. I think really what is important for the problem that you are delimiting there is the question whether you can appeal can solve the problem by appealing to a notion of karma that only operates in this life. Yeah? And I think the answer is probably no to that, because the number of constructions you need to appeal for are much more than we could explain in terms of the link between intention and hedonic states. So I think the issue is actually not with karma, it is with the idea that there's a really long stretch of consciousness of which the present life is only one part.
Yes, I agree. I completely agree. Yeah.
To an extent, my first question was actually answered pretty sufficiently by the entire conversation. It was really just about turning this question back on the analytic side, and why are they not subject to Barnhall's original question too? This idea of segregation as opposed to exclusion. Can't you just ask the same question and then would the answer you not get something like evolution or some kind of brain mechanism not be subject to the same charge as your answer of karma? And this raises, so what I'm going to ask is now kind of a second level question, which is, there's now, I see two different strategies here. One is to demystify karma or take away the spookiness of it to make it more palatable to those who would give their own answers to something like segregation. Or what I see you actually appealing to is double down on the spookiness as a way of putting a mirror up to other people to say, like, are your terms like evolution not equally spooky themselves?
Yeah.
So is that an accurate summation? If so, do you think we should spookify those who maybe are allergic to the idea, or should we translate karma into something that's more palatable to those who don't want to go to that place?
So this is a question that has actually haunted me since the first time I tried to present my research, because the other stuff I work on is even weirder. I actually work with a Shiva tradition where not just is everything consciousness, but consciousness is actually Shiva, and the universe exists because Shiva desires to experience himself in diverse forms, and it is philosophically brilliant. If you follow the arguments, I actually think it's one of the most tightly argued accounts of how it is we could exist in a world that I have ever seen. And it is so difficult to at all get off the ground with trying to talk about even a small aspect of that, because there are so many basic assumptions and worldviews that aren't shared, that if you're not very careful in saying, okay, this is actually different than what you're thinking, then you get into the problem of like people not knowing what they don't know. And so then assuming that certain things mean one thing when they don't. And so my technique has been to very nicely and happily be spooky, but like try to do it in a way that some of the instinct to turn off when you're confronted with something that's fundamentally challenging is addressed by a kind of like, honestly, just by an openness and an enthusiasm. And it's weird to say that performance matters in how we do philosophy, but it's been my experience that I've been able to talk to people in part, not just because of what I'm saying, but because of how I'm listening and how I'm presenting things.
Okay, thank you very much, Ken.